welcome back to my channel. Apologies that it has been rather a long time since my last video. I've been quite preoccupied with various things like getting a new fridge freezer, which was quite stressful last week. So yeah, just lots of different things going on, being a bit preoccupied, so I haven't had the time or the energy to do a video. But I am back. I'd like to talk today, it's actually something that I've been reading about recently and something that I'm quite interested in on a sort of philosophical level. I want to talk about the radical feminist position on gender and gender identity, because if you've been on social media or are just generally sort of active in the online world, you will probably be aware that there's been a lot of discussion around gender, and there's a whole range of gender identities out there nowadays, particularly among younger people, sort of teenagers and people in their sort of early 20s, but older people as well, kind of jumping on this bandwagon. There's lots of gender identities out there that weren't there in the past, and this can all be very confusing and kind of baffling, and maybe so I wanted to talk to you today about the radical feminist position on all of this, which is controversial for some people. And radical feminists often get cancelled because people can get quite precious about their identities and things like that. But I want to be out and clear about this. I am a radical feminist. I discovered this quite recently because I already had my views on gender and sex and things like that. And I've done a lot of reading about this. Like I've read Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and other feminist books, and I've always had sort of some interest in feminism. Obviously, I don't go around my life thinking about feminism that much, but like, you know, because I've got more important things to think about. But like, I do consider myself, yeah, I guess a radical feminist in terms of what I naturally sort of seem to think. And so I've been doing some reading, and I came across this article in, I don't know if you're pronouncing this correctly, Aeon magazine, AEON, which is an online sort of magazine where people often like contribute quite serious philosophical articles and essays and things like that. So I came across this article by someone called Rebecca Riley Cooper, who's a political philosopher. She's a UK political philosopher, and she wrote an article which I very much agree with, having read it. This kind of very strongly aligns with my own sort of views on the matter. But the article is called "Gender is Not a Spectrum." Gender is not a spectrum. If you Google it, it will come up. Rebecca Riley Cooper. So first of all, she makes a very important distinction between sex, biological sex, and gender. That's a crucial distinction, but the two terms, biological sex and gender, often get confused. Like, people sometimes use them interchangeably, and that's a massive category mistake because they're two completely different things. So first things first, this should be fairly obvious to anyone. Some of the differences between women and men are traceable to biology. So that's pretty clear. You know, in a nutshell, it sort of comes down to your reproductive apparatus. Do you have a penis? Do you have a vagina? That's a very basic biological distinction. Obviously there are others, like women tend to have bigger breasts than men. Obviously some men do have man boobs, but on the whole women have bigger breasts than men. Their mammary glands are bigger because they're designed for feeding babies, and you know, women are on average smaller than men. Obviously, again, there are exceptions to that rule, but on average, women are smaller than men. Women usually have less muscles. You know, have less muscles than men, are less muscular than men. Women and men are prone to different diseases. There's different hormones and so on. So that's clear. But other differences between women and men are not essential, are not natural, are not rooted in that basic biology, but instead are rooted in environment, culture, and upbringing. This is gendered socialisation. Gender is completely different to sex because gender is not innate, gender is not essential, gender is not rooted in your biology. Instead, gender is applied to your reproductive apparatus. So depending on whether or not you have a vagina or a penis, society will apply different gendered expectations onto you. And there's nothing essential about that, and it depends a lot on your culture, and so on. But we live in a patriarchal society, and in a patriarchal society, women are gendered to be submissive, weak, passive. And any woman who goes against the grain and is assertive and maybe a little bit, I don't know, feisty or whatever, people can be very negative about that. And vice versa, if a man is submissive and weak, he can also be teased and bullied for that, and there can be a whole host of repercussions for that because it goes against what society expects. Now, obviously, if you're autistic, this might be a bit different because we tend to be, speaking very generally, and very generally, obviously, because there are exceptions, but autistics, because we're kind of a little bit more like aloof and kind of do our own thing, we're more likely to step outside what people expect for our gender, and that can obviously add to kind of things like that because we're basically less socialised. But obviously it's still going to impact us, like we're still part of society, obviously we're not outside of that completely, it's just that maybe we're a bit less prone to some of this. But clearly, obviously, autistic people are still exposed to all of this gendered socialisation, and obviously it's going to impact how we behave, so you might have slight differences on average and very crude differences, and obviously there's great variation, and I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that this is the norm, but certainly you across an average, if you were to take like a group of autistic people, you might find some slight differences in terms of how autism is expressed between boys and girls and in women. I don't think it's as extreme as what people say it is, but you're going to find some slight differences just because, boys and girls are socialised differently, so obviously it's going to impact a bit how autism is expressed. So gender is an externally imposed set of norms that dictate behaviour to individuals. There's a binary caste system, a hierarchy, where if you're male gendered, you are put above a female gender. Male is seen as better than female. That's kind of implicit within culture, sometimes explicit as well. But there is this assumption that male is better than female. And that's played out in so many different ways, right through to how women are paid, through to the fact that men can take their tops off in public and women can't, and so on and so on and so on. So that's gender. Gender is oppressive. It oppresses both women and men. Women are more oppressed than men by gender in a patriarchal society, obviously, but men are also oppressed as well, and we mustn't forget that. Feminism is equally applicable to men as it is to women in that respect, and men can call themselves feminists too, because all of this affects men, not just women, and it will make everyone's lives better if we could get rid of gender. That's what I'm coming on to. So because it constrains potential. Gender. So we need to abolish gender. That's the radical feminist position. We should abolish gender. Stop putting people into pink and blue boxes. Now, this view, the radical feminist position, which I've just outlined, sits very uneasily with those who experience gender as internal and innate. People who experience gender as internal and innate are kind of confusing categories. Sex is internal and innate, and some people who are transsexual experience a radical kind of dysphoria, where they really do feel they're in the wrong biological body. So you might have a woman who really feels she should be in a male body. This is a real thing, and it's transsexual, and these people need to be protected, and they often face a lot of transphobia and things like that, but it's a real thing, something different clearly about these people, and they often need to transition, and take, hormones and things like that. But that's transsexual. That's completely different to transgender, because you're confusing different things here. Transsexual people feel out of place in their biological sexed body. Some people call themselves transgender, but these people don't want to transition and don't need to transition. For them, it's more about that they feel that they're in the wrong gender. But gender, don't forget, is a construct. It's not the same as biological sex. It's a construct. And saying that you are out of place in your gender doesn't really make sense. Because gender's a construct. It's not like biological sex. Gender is applied to you by other people. Biological sex is something you're born with, and some people because, I don't know, science, I guess, is looking as to why this is. There may be many different causes that we don't really know about, but some people literally do feel out of place in their biological body. But that's completely different to people saying that they feel out of place with gender, because gender is a construct. And that's where the category mistake happens. And that's what radical feminism is challenging. And that's why radical feminists often get cancelled and are often accused of transphobia when they're anything but transphobic. J.K. Rowling was not a transphobic, that's a myth. She really wasn't, but she got cancelled for saying some stuff similar to this. I can't remember exactly what she said. But yeah. Now, so these people, and they often call themselves non-binary and things like that, these people dispute that gender is entirely constructed, and they reject the radical feminist analysis that there is a hierarchy, male and female, which is like two genders that society has created that apply to male bodies and female, and I should say that apply to women bodies, male bodies and female bodies. There's a hierarchy, a hierarchical gender with two positions. They deny that. Queer feminists deny that. So this is the queer feminist position I'm talking about. Queer feminists deny that gender is entirely constructed, and that's where there's this big difference there between a queer feminist position and a radical feminist position. I'm a radical feminist, so I disagree with the queer feminist view. For queer feminists, what makes the operation of gender oppressive is not that it is socially constructed, rather the problem is the belief that there are only two genders. So instead they create a whole gender spectrum. So they create more genders because they have this mistaken belief that gender is innate, and people have an innate sense of gender, and some people don't feel they can connect or feel for binary genders. They feel outside of that. They think they're non-binary. So you have to create new genders that they feel are innate, but they're confusing what's innate and what's constructed, as I've already talked about, because gender, the radical distinction always should be between sex, biological sex, which is what we're born with, penis, vagina, hormones, reproductive apparatus, how we look physically, and gender, which is then applied to that, and that's a construct. That's more to do with our interests, our aspirations, our goals, what we like, what we're interested in, how we behave. That's gender. The queer feminists believe that gender is internal and innate, but they believe that there are more genders than just woman or man. So genderqueer feminists say genderqueer is often used to be synonymous to non-binary or pangender, by the way. They say that gender is not a binary but a spectrum, and that's what this article is challenging, the idea that gender is a spectrum. Okay, so I'm going to move over to video number 2 now, so moving over to video number 2.